Okay, and they're coming in now. Everyone is in the meeting now, Tracy.
Great, thank you, Nora. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tracy Lalaberty, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, and it is my pleasure to be able to welcome you to the Zoom presentation today on behalf of the Center, University of Minnesota's College of Education and Human Development, and the School of Social Work. Today's event is made possible through funds by the United States Department of Health and Human Services that is managed through the Minnesota Department of Human Services Child Safety and Permanency Division. This webinar is the second in a series that we have put together focused on permanency and transition to adulthood for youth in the child welfare system. We typically have an in-person conference each spring. However, due to COVID-19, we were unable to gather in that way this year, and so we've put together this webinar series. We are fortunate that we have technology available to us in this country that brings us together virtually so that we can still learn and gather together. We must start this seminar by acknowledging that our university and the land on which we are broadcasting this webinar from in Minnesota is the unceded, traditional, ancestral, and contemporary land of the Dakota people, who are the first people of Minnesota Makoche. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and work to hold the university and our partners and ourselves accountable to American Indian peoples and nations. We also acknowledge slavery's deep roots and recognize the significant role that captive and free African Americans have played in building our country, the United States of today. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to Karina Berry, Denise Cooper, Karen Sheehan, and Nora Lee from our outreach team for their diligent work over a difficult few months to bring both the CW 360 publication and this webinar series to fruition. And now I'd like to introduce Karina Berry, our Director of Outreach, and she will introduce you to our speaker.
Bonjour, hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in and thank you for our patience getting started this morning. I'll just quickly share some logistics. We will be utilizing the chat box for questions, comments, so please feel free to engage there throughout the presentation. Our team will keep an eye on the chat box and let Paul know when you have questions that feel timely. But we also will aim to save time at the end to have to offer more time for question and answer as well. And you will see I put in the chat box that a link to our 2020 CW 360 publication, which focuses on supporting permanency and transitions to adulthood for youth in care. And we just published that this past week. There are 20 plus articles in there on a broad range of topics all around supporting youth related to permanency and transitions to adulthood. So please check that out. I also included the link to the rest of our fall webinar series. And we have a number of webinars coming up over the coming weeks, and we would love you to tune in and continue to have really great conversations around these important topics with us. So at this time, I will introduce our speaker for today, Paul Meinhard, who is the Minor Connect Coordinator at the Minnesota Department of Human Services. So Paul, feel free to get us started.
Thank you, Karina. And good morning, everyone. Thanks to all of you for joining me for the next hour to hear about Minor Connect. Minor Connect is a pilot that was housed in Hennepin County and operated for 2 years. And it was a pilot aimed at increasing the capacity to provide services to minors who are experiencing homelessness as they live apart from their parents. They're on their own and experiencing homelessness. Karina, if you can go to the next slide. So each year there's a point in time count. And what that is when people go out and they count people physically just count people who are homeless, either unsheltered or sheltered. And they do that in January of every year. This past January, 750 youth, that's youth under the age of 24, were counted as experiencing homelessness on that night. That number, 750, has increased by 9% since the 2019 point in time count. And I just want to share a little bit about who those people are. As you can see from the slide, 88% of those youth are 18 to 24, and 12% are under 18. And then the location, 47% are in greater Minnesota, and 53% are in metro areas. Now, the Minnesota legislature funded the pilot to develop a response system to meet the needs of these minors who are experiencing homelessness. And that pilot started on April 1st of 2018 and then ran until June 30th of 2020. If you could go to the next slide. So just so you know, this is for Karina, I am not seeing what other people are seeing, so hopefully our slides will continue to link up. So this is the responsibility to provide services. First and foremost, it's the responsibility of the family. The family system has the responsibility to provide for minors. But for some minors, that family system simply does not exist. Perhaps the minors do not have living parents or guardians, or their connection to the family has been lost while the minors are in the foster care system. For other minors, that family system is just not supportive. The minors leave home or are asked to leave home by a parent who's struggling to provide a home for younger siblings. And so when that minor gets to be a certain age, the parent, out of desperation, says, I need you to go off on your own because I need to take the resources that I have to provide for your siblings. Or it could be that the minors leave home, or they're asked to leave home due to some family conflict, which all too often really is driven by the emergence of the minor's LGBTQ identity. For other minors, the home might just not be safe. Because of violence in the home, minors temporarily live at a friend's house. They stay outdoors, sleeping in a vehicle or other place not meant for shelter, or they accept shelter from someone who may be exploiting them. Now, if the family system fails to keep minors safe, then the responsibility shifts to the child welfare system. So the next slide is the responsibility of the child welfare system. And a child welfare response is not always desired or appropriate for a minor experiencing homelessness. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that minors often fear involvement with public safety net systems. System involvement could mean a loss of independence. It could impact their education or result in legal or other sanctions for their family. The minors may actively strive to avoid detection and try to pass like they're housed counterpoints. In other cases, minors do not see themselves as needing system involvement. The minors may think of themselves as couch hopping, but not homeless, as being in the midst of a family crisis, but not homeless, as sleeping in their car, but not homeless. Homeless youth providers can be frustrated by a Child Protective Services response. Either Child Protection would not open a case, and the homeless youth provider wanted the case open. They felt that the services from the Child Welfare Agency were needed, and yet they weren't able to access them. Or Child Protection would open a case, and the intervention by Child Protection would traumatize the minor. Court removal from a family, even a family that's failed, a family system that's failed the minor, is still trauma for the minor. The child protection response could include placement in foster care to meet the minor's needs. For some minors, when they're coming out of a home situation that was not good for them, to be placed in another home situation doesn't feel safe to them. The making of the report for the minor could expose their siblings or their parents to the attention, would bring them to the attention of child protection. And even when siblings are not safe in the care of their parents, to be the one who brought the family to the attention of child protection is traumatic for a minor. And for minors who are parenting, who are parents themselves, the fear of going to child protection is that then their own parenting would come under scrutiny of the child protection system. And so for these reasons, the child welfare system, although it has the responsibility, might not be the best choice. But let's look a little more at that. If we can go to the next slide. So why have a child welfare response? Well, in part, it's the established system, right? And so let's just improve on what we have. And it's also the established responsibility. Child welfare has the legal responsibility to provide services to minors. And that's the framework we have. And let's continue to work within that framework. To try to change that, to give that authority to someone else, first of all, that's a big lift. And secondly, I don't know that we would be any better off. We already have an agency who has the experience of doing it, and let's just make that agency improve in terms of what they can offer. Third reason for child protection is that the current environment is demanding change. Child welfare is a system that we know impacts people who do not have access to white privilege differently than people who do have access to white privilege. And we can and must do better than normal. That's the name of the title of an article by Melissa Merrick, who's president of the Prevent Child Abuse America. But it's just one of many articles from many different sources calling for child protection to change how it does business. And so the environment is good for having a child welfare response and improving that response to meet the needs of minors experiencing homelessness. And lastly, there is system overlap. There's overlap between the child welfare system, the homeless youth provider system, and services for sex trafficked youth. So we want to strengthen that overlap, strengthen those bridges between systems so that minors can access the best parts of each system. And they aren't left with just one system. So next slide, please. The current practice, we have the child welfare system who is providing services to minors experiencing homelessness. We have the homeless youth providers who are also providing services to minors experiencing homelessness. What we don't have is a lot of overlap between the two. So child welfare has the minors it is providing services to, homeless youth providers have the minors they are providing services to, but there's not a lot of overlap in terms of the provision of services between the two systems. Now, yes.
Just one quick question. What was the name of the article? What was the article called?
It's called "We Can and Must Do Better Than Normal."
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Now, I should point out, within the homeless youth providers, there's already a high level of partnership and collaboration existing among homeless youth providers. The Youth Services Network, YSN, resulted from that partnership. But the partnership that exists between homeless youth providers does not extend to Hennepin County child welfare. That partnership between Hennepin County Child Welfare and the homeless youth providers has not been strong. And so that is what the pilot has achieved to have happen. Now there's reasons why it hasn't already happened, or that why it might not be that strong. And if we go to the next slide, the child protection system has a different focus than the homeless youth providers. In child protection, the focus is young children. For homeless youth providers, it's older teens and young adults. In child protection, the client is the parent. For homeless youth providers, the client is the youth. In child protection, we have statutes that define who is a parent, who is a relative, who is a sibling. For homeless youth providers, the youth defines who is their family, and that would dictate who the agency will work with is based on who the youth defines as their family. In child protection laws are generally designed for young children. In the homeless youth providers, laws are generally designed for young adults, 18 to 24-year-olds. So it's kind of interesting, in both systems, the design is adapted to meet the needs of teens. And both systems serve teens, but neither is the law specifically, a lot of the law specifically drafted with teens in mind. In child protection, we have a focus on more immediate safety. And I'm going to call it short-term goals, even though the goal is to have it last forever. But the idea with child protection is offer services to the family, bring the family into the system, offer services, support them in healing from those services, and then sending them back out in a quick kind of fashion, you know, before the permanency timelines run, so to speak. In the homeless youth area, they can focus on longer term goals, and they can work with the youth without that timeline running. Child protection, it tends to be a risk aversion system. Homeless Youth Act, it's a harm reduction system. Child protection, the response is somewhat driven by the court, if the court is providing oversight. And even those child protection cases that aren't in court, it's a system that is driving the response. Within the homeless youth providers, the response is driven by the youth, and they have the freedom to do that. In child protection, services are going to end once permanency is established. Permanency includes reunification with the parents, but if that's not going to happen, a permanent placement somewhere else. For homeless youth providers, because those services are voluntary, really they don't end. I mean, a minor can come back anytime and re-engage, but from a standpoint of when a case is done, it would be when when independence is established for that minor. So they have those different focuses, which makes it a little harder for them to work together because those the focuses don't necessarily align with each other. If we can go to the next slide, there's also a different foundation for best practice. So in the child welfare system, the foundation of best practice is 3 goals: child safety, child well-being, and permanency. When we're on the next slide, for the homeless provision or homeless service providers, the foundation for their best practice is based on the 9 evidence-based guiding principles to help youth overcome homelessness. And you can see them there on your screen. It's journey-oriented, trauma-informed, non-judgmental, harm reduction, strength-based, holistic, establishing trusting youth-adult relationships, collaborative, and using the principles of positive youth development. Now, for many systems, all of those are part of the child protection system, are part of what the county system is striving for and using, but they are not the foundation for best practice in the child welfare system, really the foundation is child safety, child well-being, and permanency. In the homeless youth arena, these 9 guiding principles are really the foundational basis for their best practice when working with youth.
Paul, we have a question.
Yes.
Are there any studies that show the correlation between young adults who were involved with CPS and are now part of the homeless youth program?
Yes. And I don't know if there's more to the question. I mean, I'm not that familiar with those studies, but it is not uncommon for young people who are aging out of child protection to then end up homeless. It's actually a high a percentage of that. That is a risk factor for experiencing homelessness. So it exists in that situation as well. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but youth who are coming out of child welfare and just aging out of the system are more at risk of experiencing homelessness than youth who were not in the system. If we could go to the next slide. Homelessness is a racial equity issue. Black people are overrepresented among people experiencing homelessness, and poverty rates alone do not explain this overrepresentation. So now I'm talking about just generally, not only youth, but this work has been done by the SPARC community. SPARC stands for Supporting Partnerships for Anti-Racist Communities. It's a national organization who does work across the country in terms of, as their name suggests, helping communities become anti-racist. They actually are doing some work in Minnesota, in a few counties in Minnesota. But one of the things that they have brought to light is that Black people represent 13% of the general population. And yet, I don't have the exact number here, but I'm going to say I think it's 26% of people who are living in poverty and 40% of people who are experiencing homelessness. And so we used to think that homelessness was driven by poverty, that the main thing causing people to experience homelessness was a lack of money. And if that were the case, then we would expect that 26% of people living in poverty to be the same as people who are experiencing homelessness. But it goes up, people experiencing homelessness for Black people. And so the current thinking is it's systemic racism. It's a racial equity issue and not a poverty issue. If we can go to the next slide. So here's the racial identity. Oh, I'm sorry. We're still on the same slide. Let's go to the next one. So I'm looking at the racial identity overall, a bar graph. And this comes from the point in time count. And what this, so this is the state of Minnesota. And so 42% of the people who were counted as experiencing homelessness on that night in January were Black, 38% were white, 10% were Native, 8% were multiple races, and 2% were Asian Pacific Islander. I don't have, so what this illustrates is that there still is this overrepresentation of people, of Black people who are experiencing homelessness, right? Because even though I don't have the figure for you in terms of in Minnesota, what the percentage of Black people is in the general population, we know it's less than 42%. We can tell that just by looking around. We know it's not 42%. So it's more than the general population. I would just say that. If we can go to the next slide. So
we have a comment. I'm just going to read. Black children are also overrepresented in foster care and the child welfare system.
Yes, which I would say is a systemic racism issue as well. And we see that played out in the child welfare system, and we see it played out in the people who are experiencing homelessness. Mark Dones was a keynote speaker at the 2018 Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless Conference. And he talked about this issue because he was with Spark at the time. And so he talked about this issue and presented the information on it. And then he made this comment: if you are working in this area and you are doing nothing to dismantle systemic racism, you are wasting your time. And what he was saying is, if we're not looking at the racism impact, we're never going to successfully end homelessness. And so we're just wasting our time. He also said, if you're working on a pilot, you're wasting your time. But I don't want to go down that path, but you know, I heard that as well. But I want to talk about the statement about the systemic racism and whether we're addressing it or not. And so I want to share with you 3 of my own experiences around racism. The first is that both my grandmothers were members of the DAR, the Daughters of American Revolution. And you get into that organization by being able to trace your lineage in this country back to the time of the Revolutionary War. So my ancestors have been in this country since the time of the Revolutionary War. And when they fought that Revolutionary War and they won their independence. But my ancestors didn't make a clean break from England, because one of the things that they carried with them was this notion that it's necessary to exercise dominion and control over other people. You know, that's a British Empire belief, and they came with that, and they set up a system in this country that enforces, allows, sets up this notion of it's okay to exercise dominion and control over other people. And I hear the voices of my ancestors. As I start to dismantle that system, I hear their voices saying, no, don't dismantle what we set up to benefit you. And I hear those voices and I fight those voices every day because I'm dismantling that system anyway. Second thing I just want to say is, shortly after law school, I was working as a legal aid attorney on the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe Reservation. And one of my responsibilities as the legal aid attorney was to do wills for elders. And I remember an elder came into my office and they wanted a will. And so we sat down and talked about what they wanted. And, you know, they didn't have a lot of property. It was a very simple will, not very long. And so after we talked, I wrote it up. They came back and looked at it and they said, well, this isn't what I want at all.
My dad would say, don't remember it, stop.
And so I said, oh, well, we talked more. And then they left and I revised the will, had to come back. And the elder said, still, this still isn't it. And so we talked again, went through it again. The elder came back and they were satisfied with that will. What I learned from that experience, what really struck me about it, is how much my culture affects my ability to really hear what someone else is saying. I was not aware of how much my cultural lens impacted my ability to really hear someone else. Third example was, I was working at the Minneapolis American Indian Center in their Indian Child Welfare Program. And when my coworkers, my Indian coworkers, would describe an interaction with a white social worker as racist, immediately in my mind, I would discount that. I'd think, well, I don't think that was really racism. That was just a misunderstanding, you know? And as I thought about that, I was thinking, well, what do I, as a white cisgender male, why do I think I understand racism more than my Indian coworker? Why do I think I can identify it more than my Indian coworker? And so I made a decision that when my coworker described a situation as racist, I accepted it as true. Even though that voice still came up in my head, and even though it didn't feel right to me, I accepted it as true. And when I did that, I started seeing racism all over the place. Now, seeing another person's experience as equally valid to my own was new territory for me. And it can also be dangerous territory. And if we can go to the next slide. You know, after a while, I just start to think, hey, I got this. You know, I'm living as a cross-cultural being. But it's not true. No matter how much I thought I was understanding another person's culture, I didn't truly understand it because I was not able to live their culture. And I couldn't live their culture because I have access to white privilege and they don't. And there's no amount of education, understanding, or appreciation of another person's culture that can level the playing field when white privilege is in the game. You know, it's not enough to see racism not enough to see it where I didn't see it before, because racism by itself does not bestow on me the authority to oppress others. That's white privilege. White privilege is what bestows on me, by virtue of my having access to it, the authority to oppress others. It's white privilege that needs to go. And I'm still trying to figure out how to dismantle it, but talking about it with you is part of that process. If we can go on to the next slide. So coming back to the current practice, child welfare, working with minors experiencing homeless youth providers working with minors experiencing homelessness. Next slide. The new way of doing business is for those two systems to come together, and that the minors experiencing homelessness are part of both systems and benefiting from both systems in a way that partnership is stronger and more cohesive than it ever has been. That was the goal of the pilot. And so we started off, next slide, please. We started off with our Minor Connect page partners. You know, it's not maybe the best way to say it, but it is what it is. So here's the design team for Minor Connect, for the pilot. And I just want to say the Minnesota Department of Human Services, there are two divisions within DHS that impacted or had impact, on the pilot. One is Child Safety and Permanency. That's the division I'm in. The other is the Office of Economic Opportunity. And the Office of Economic Opportunity has grants for homeless service providers. And so grants were awarded to the YMCA, to the Legal Aid, who does their youth law project, to the Link. Those were the three community partners that we had. Hennepin County received money from DHS, well, through the legislature, a legislative grant, to participate in the pilot. And then the Minnesota Interagency Council on Homelessness was a big piece of this, because part of the state plan, Minnesota's state plan for ending homelessness, is to specifically end homelessness for minors who are on their own experiencing homelessness. And so they really have been an invaluable partner in all of this. And so that's who it is. Each one of those partners brings a slightly different take to it. What the money really, it does a few different things, but the main thing it does is it allows the county and the agencies to designate staff to work the pilot and to work with the minors who came into the pilot. Now, so that was the pilot, and really it's about the community agencies already had a deep level of partnership, as I said before, going on, but not with the county, and the county not with them. And so it was really about that. And if you go to the next slide, so what we end up with that is a coordinated service delivery between these two systems, a shared responsibility for meeting the needs of those minors who are experiencing homelessness, and we get the best practice within homeless youth providers that they use, and the best practice within child welfare, child protection, because we have both agencies who are steeped in those best practice alternatives coming together and working together with the minors. Next slide. After about a year into the pilot, we had the Minor Connect vision. We did a little visioning exercise to help us move forward into the next year. And I just want to share with you this. So we had one unifying belief that would provide the direction for us as we moved forward. And that belief is that change is possible. Behind that, we had two action statements to give us momentum to engage in the work. One was acknowledge violence and harm to achieve systemic healing and transformation. The second was to accept collective responsibility to provide what youth identify and what youth want and what they need. Behind that were three principles to provide the stability needed to keep us on the path. One of those principles was to communicate the crisis and center the voice of youth. Second was to have youth input and experience matters. To acknowledge that youth input and experience matters. And the third was that policy changes are needed. So that was some of our vision moving forward with the pilot. If we can go to the next slide. I just want to share with you some of what we had in the pilot. 156 minors were referred to Minor Connect. And here's the racial breakdown. 63% of those minors were Black or African American, 22% were white, 3% were Native, and then Asian, Native Hawaiian, and multiracial were each 1%. So that's the racial breakdown in terms of the minors who were served by the pilot. We can go to the next slide. We have the gender identity. 59% were female, identified female, 35% identified male. And then we have gender nonconforming and trans and refuse to answer each at 1% each. So that's, if we can go to the next slide, I'm just running through this. So that's an idea of who they were in terms of racial and gender identity. What I want to show you here, I realize that you can't really see the numbers because it's kind of slow, kind of not very tall in a lot of areas. But what this graph really shows is the trend. And so the blue bars are the housing situation for the minors when they entered the pilot. And the green bars are the housing situation the minors were in when their case with Minor Connect was closed. And so what I want to highlight here is that, the biggest cluster for minors who were coming in was couch hopping. And then the second biggest was shelter. And so the vast majority of minors were either couch hopping or in shelter when they entered Minor Connect. And then if we look at the green, we can see that the biggest grouping was living with parents when their Minor Connect case closed. And you can see we really doubled the amount of minors who were living with their parents through the services provided in the pilot. And then we have another group living with the relative or living with a friend. The difference there between the couch hopping is that the couch hopping didn't provide stability, in that a lot of times the minor themselves didn't have an arrangement with the caregiver in the home. They might have just been with some friend and they're just at their friend's house and they have no idea when the caregiver, the adult in the home, is going to say, you need to leave. And so here, we've provided more stability through the pilot, through the work with the pilot, in terms of having a conversation with the caregiver. What's your commitment here? Are you willing to commit to this youth? The other one towards in the middle, that tall green one, is permanent supportive housing. So those would be the minors who, for whatever reason, were not able to be with their family or relatives. And so they were in permanent supportive housing. So that's how the housing situation changed for the minors. If we can go to the next slide. My hope is that you are all thinking, why aren't we doing this? And that's a good question. And I want to share with you some of the lessons we learned about effective partnerships and what this could look like in your agency. And so the first question is, who are you going to partner with? And, you know, that's who in your area is also doing this work. If you are a nonprofit, you know, then obviously it's your county system is engaged in this work as well. If you're in the county system, what nonprofits are there around, or schools, or who can you partner with to do this work? Who else in your area is working with minors who are experiencing homelessness? And then the next question that we dealt with when we set up the pilot is also, who's at the table? And what I mean by this is, obviously you need people with decision-making authority. So as you are bringing partners, potential partners together, you need people with decision-making authority from those different agencies and from your own agency. And you also need people who are doing the direct service delivery to the minors. Because part of working things out is, what are the roles? What are the responsibilities? Who's doing what? And so you need to know what's happening with the direct service and what their experiences are and what their limitations are. A third thing that you need at the table to be aware of, and this is really, who are your doers and who are your dreamers? I'm a dreamer, and if I'm at a table with only dreamers, we can talk a lot about what's possible, but we never do it because there's nobody saying, well, if we're actually going to do that, here are the tasks we need to do. You know, here's what needs to happen. We just come up with possibilities. Similarly, if you have a table, if you only have doers at the table, everybody jumps in and they start doing tasks. And then you get down the road and it's like, well, where are we headed? I don't even know really why we're doing these tasks, because there's no vision. There's no dreamer who's giving direction to the work that's being done. So as you bring people together, it's nice just to consider, okay, who's visionary, who's implementers in this process. The third thing to consider is, how many tables are there? And I'll just say, you know, what this has to do with is, do the people who are doing the direct service, you need some of them, you need them at the table, you need management, supervisors at the table, and you need upper level administration involved, right? And so, and when we started the pilot, we just had one table. It was all those people in one room at the table talking about what needed to be happening. And as the pilot got up and running and started moving, we realized that it wasn't working to have everybody in the room at once. You know, the direct service staff, they needed to check in with the other direct service staff. You know, they needed to talk about roles and referrals and communication with each other. I mean, they got together they wanted to come together to do case consults. And they're all working with the same youth. Sometimes they're case managing a youth, and they're transitioning youth from one service provider to another based on the needs of that youth and where that youth is at. All of that, they need to work out. Well, administration doesn't really need to be part of that conversation. And to a certain extent, unless there's some issue, some higher up issue, management, supervisors don't really need to be a part of that conversation, as long as someone is facilitating the referral process and how that gets worked out. So that was one table that we had, direct service people. And then we broke down another Minor Connect operations committee. And that was one who was really overseeing, well, just providing oversight and resolving issues for the pilot in terms of the structure and operation and how it's going to operate. And we needed information that the direct service people had, but they didn't have to be at the table because really it's that's a management level look at what's going on. And the third table that we had was Homeless Youth Act providers more broadly. You know, we had our paid partners, but there's also partners out there that were volunteer. I mean, they're doing the work, but they didn't receive a grant under the pilot to specifically designate staff to work with the pilot, but they're still working with minors, and they still are part of this system that the pilot is a part of. And so we had meetings with the broader homeless youth providers in the area. And they would make recommendations and talk about solutions. We actually worked on a community work plan with different priorities. And for each priority, we would meet and we would talk about what's working, what's not working, what are possible solutions. And that information would then go to the Minor Connect operations team for them to look at in terms of if there's things that they could take from that and improvements and changes that they could make to the pilot. So that's the situation that we had. I am aware of the time, and there's not a lot of time left, so I'm going to kind of move more quickly through this. Next slide is a lessons learned. And I just want to say, one of the things we learned is that wanting to collaborate wasn't enough to sustain collaboration. And we ran into wrinkles. And one of the things that we learned about that is, you know, it's the direct service staff who built trust. And they built trust with the minors that they were serving, and they built trust with each other because they're in there doing the work, working side by side. Administration, management from different agencies did not build the same level of trust that the direct service staff built with each other and with the minors. And this model, the feedback from the minors is they really liked it. The feedback from the staff doing the direct service, they really liked it. And I think it's primarily because they built an environment of trust. And, you know, that's what's missing in a lot of people's families of minors who are experiencing homelessness, or for the minors themselves, is a lack of trust. And so to have a system where that trust is strong really was helpful. If we can go to the next slide. So as you are thinking about doing this, I just throw this out there. This is the International Association of Public Participation, Spectrum of Public Participation, but I adapted it for partnership. And so here's what you do is you decide what level of partnership you're going to have. And is it just to inform, if you want to click, or are you going to consult? If you click again, are you going to involve? Are you going to collaborate? Are you going to empower? And so those are the choices. And you can see underneath there the level of partnership that is provided or required in each of those things. One of the things that we found that we didn't do is we didn't do an MOU up front. And that would have been helpful for us to really nail down, where are we? What is our partnership? Are we in empowerment, which really the pilot was? We pretty much decided things together and it implemented what was decided, rather than one person holding on to the authority and just taking information from other people or collaborating with other people. So that's really what we did, and that's what we found the most helpful. And so that's what I would encourage, though, is that MOU up front. We started with the county because they received their money first, and then the homeless service providers received their money, so they entered, but the county was already up and running and some decisions had been made, and that led to, well, what are the roles? What are the responsibilities? We ran into some friction around those issues that would have been avoided had we had everybody together before we ever started the work with an MOU to work some of those issues out. Next slide. That's the agency culture. Let's go. I'm just going to keep us moving because I want some time for questions. So next slide, we share common ground. Next slide, resources for providers. So these are just 3 places at the state level where you can go if you are working with people who are experiencing homelessness, youth or adults. But the Heading Home Alliance website, there's a lot of movement, energy around providing services to address homelessness. And a lot of that is fueled by the pandemic and people who are experiencing homelessness at a higher risk of vulnerability with COVID. And so there's been a lot of action. And so Heading Home Alliance website is where that is captured. They have resources for public health, for funding resources, state and local programs to promote housing stability, executive orders. They also, that's where you can sign up for these weekly provider webinars, which are held every Wednesday at 1 o'clock. And that's updates specific to people working with staff who are working with, or organizations who are working with people experiencing homelessness. And then the third is the Minnesota Housing e-news. And you can just sign up for that at the Minnesota Housing website. You click on e-news in the bottom right-hand corner of their opening web page, and you get e-news from Minnesota Housing. And that's, again, about funding opportunities or just other things that are happening in terms of across the state for people who are providing services to people who experience homelessness. Next slide. So I just want to end with an impact that you can have right now. And so this youth I was having a conversation, and what the youth said is they walk around town and they see all this new housing being built. New housing being built for people who already have homes. And yet nothing being built for people who do not have homes, people like them. And it just makes them feel like they don't matter. And when we offer compassion and support for what someone is going through, the message we give them is that you matter to me. And that message is made stronger when the support is being offered not only by me, but by my agency. And stronger yet when it's being offered not just by my agency, but by a network of agencies working in partnership with each other. That's the benefit of partnership that comes without any additional resources. It strengthens the message to minors experiencing homelessness that you do matter. Thank you for your attention. I'll end there. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions or comments.
Sure, and we have a couple questions. Is there data on Latinx youth? I didn't see that category represented.
I do not have data on that. There is some out there, but honestly, I don't know what it says in terms of the rates of experiencing homelessness. So I guess I'll stay with what I know, and that would be, I don't know for sure what that what the studies would say on that.
Okay, and the next question is, here in my county in California, there tends to be a bright line between services provided to minors and those provided to non-minor youth. My perception is that some of this is due to child welfare system liability concerns. To what extent do your providers also work with non-minor youth, and how did this make collaboration with county child welfare more complex? Anything you did to address this?
So the pilot was really designed to work with minors. And so even though the agency was working with people up to the age of 24, or I'll say under the age of 25, when they are dealing with minors, it's a different service delivery for even within that agency. Because I don't know if in California, if minors can consent to the services, or if you need parental consent, there's that issue. And so there's already is this difference. And the services that are going to help a minor are different than the services that are going to help a 21-year-old. And so the agencies themselves who are working with a larger age span already are dividing up their response to minors versus their response to 18 to 24-year-olds. So there is that division most likely within their agencies anyway. And so they have a branch or a response that's tailored to minors that would fit with the, correlate with the response coming from child protection. When you mentioned the issue of the legal responsibility of child protection, what that does is it limits the ability of the county to really engage in partnership. And that's why that spectrum of partnership is important, because the county is going to feel the weight of their legal responsibility, and they can't transfer that liability onto a different agency. And so they are going to have to maintain work within their liability issue, as you mentioned, and that's going to impact the level of their partnership. I was actually amazed at how willing Hennepin County was to the extent to which they were willing to engage in partnership with agencies. I think we have other counties that I'm aware of that are also doing minor connect kind of pilot stuff just on their own and really connecting with agencies. So those are the two issues. But really in terms of the agency working with older youth, they also have to tailor a response to minors that's kind of different than what they're doing with older youth. So they're already doing it in terms of that.
Right, I'm just looking at time, and so I think we caught all the questions in the chat, and I know all you are willing to share your PowerPoint, and so I can follow up with everyone with a copy of the PowerPoint that also has your contact information for maybe further questions. And we'll also send CEUs and additional resources. And I'm going to send just one more time in the chat box a link to our 2020 CW360 publication that we just published all around this topic and many others for supporting youth in care and youth transitioning out of care, as well as a link to see what's left in this fall webinar series. So Paul, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add or leave folks with before we wrap up.
I just want to encourage people to consider partnering, coming together, because it's amazing what you can do. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for joining us, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will let everyone slowly log on.